Hi, my name is Chris, and today I'd like to talk about the idea that we are all God. We are God, each and every one of us. This is a strange statement. It seems that multiple people cannot all possibly be God. Are we different and separate gods? How are we connected to God? Because in the form that we see each other, we certainly don't seem to be God or anything close to God. This fundamental idea that I'm talking about is that God is at the center. God is who we were before we were extended out into individual identities. In other words, in reality, there is only God and nothing else. God's awareness is entirely internal to God. God manifested individual identities as a way of exploring all possibilities. Our individual identities are all extensions of God. We are all very much God at the core, but we are not different gods. We are all one God, and that one God is our true nature for all of us. Now you might think, well, individual people, individual natures, how can you have one anything that represents the true nature of multiple people? Well, the closer you get to reality, the further you get away from guilt. Guilt is where you have multiplicity. Guilt is where you have a variety of forms and shapes of things conflicting and clashing and disagreeing. As we get close to the center, as we get close to reality, we see a world where everything is in agreement. Everything is based on love. And everyone is very much similar. But if we take it even higher, if we go to the very core of reality itself, beyond all the illusions, then even our individual identities are gone, and we are all essentially God, the same God. God is perfection. God is love. God's love for us is based in the fact that we are God. We are God extended outwards. God does not love us as a separate person. God does not look upon us as a separate person from himself who is somehow separate and different and deserving of compassion or mercy. God's relationship with us is entirely based on God's love of self. In other words, God in his natural state perceives himself as the only thing in existence. God perceives himself internally to his own consciousness. He perceives his own perfection. He is pure consciousness. He recognizes his own perfection and loves that perfection. God sees us as individual people, but recognizes that in reality we are all one with him. God's perception stays limited to the real and does not extend into the unreal. He allows us the honor of exploring the unreal. Therefore, in his relationship with us, he sees that we are him, and God's love for us is God's love for himself. Now this sounds like narcissism, but it isn't. God perceives the interior of his own consciousness and recognizes the perfection of it at a level that is beyond our current understanding. God, in seeing his own perfection, can only react in one way, in awe and love. God feels awe at what he sees within himself and love for the beauty and perfection of what he is. We are an extension of God. So in essence, we are God, extended into a different form in order to explore something different from the core reality of what God is. But nothing can separate us from the reality and truth that we are God. We must at some point return to that truth. So, in essence, what I'm saying is that God's love for us is nothing but his love for himself. And that God's love for himself is based on his recognition of his own perfection. Now this all sounds very odd, but that's because we think we live in a physical world. In actuality, we're seeing a world of consciousness where symbols occupy our mind. These symbols represent false ideas, which are all based in guilt. These guilt-based ideas show us a false world, and we react to it. But in actuality, everything that's occurring, everything that's happening to us is happening with our own mind. The events that happen, the people we see, the experiences we have, all these things that happen to us are not external, but are merely symbols in our own mind. We're having a conscious experience, like a dream. In a dream, there is no lion chasing you, there is no road to run down. These things don't exist. They're merely symbols in our mind. Our mind is using these symbols to evoke feelings. These feelings, in turn, are part of ideas. They express ideas. So, in essence, our physical world is an expression of an idea, and the idea is guilt. The feelings that come out of guilt are often negative, and we have negative experiences to evoke within us negative feelings. What matters is not so much the external things that we seem to experience, but the way in which they make us feel. Those feelings are at the core of what they mean. And those feelings, in turn, are based on a false idea. Through exploring a false idea, we have negative feelings, because falsehood must be in contrast to truth, and the truth is entirely positive. So, what I'm saying is essentially we're having a dream. We're having an experience in consciousness. We interpret that experience falsely as being an experience where we're in an external world. This experience occurs because we are consciously and willingly diving down into an idea to explore it. That idea is guilt. Guilt is false and does not exist in reality. Therefore, it shows us a false world, a physical world. We believe in the reality of that world because our mind wants us to believe in the reality of that world in order to understand the concept of guilt. Behind all these illusions, we are in fact actually God. There's only one being in reality, and that being is God. God is self-existing. We, however, as our individual identities, are merely projections from God. However, we're not just projections in the sense that we are all real living beings with identities that we can keep for eternity. But behind the reality of that identity is a deeper and more fundamental reality, which is that we are all essentially God. We are God. God is us. We are one. When we look at our brothers and sisters, we see in them flaws, faults, mistakes, errors. These are perceptions based in guilt. If we passed on to a level of being which was beyond guilt, we would see nothing to criticize. We would see no flaws or faults or errors, only beauty. However, we would still see individual differences. If we rose even higher towards the essence of reality, we would come so close together that we would be essentially all very much the same. We would all mirror God very closely. Imagine the idea that if God is perfection, and that beings in the other world can stand at any distance from God, either in the darkness, or in the light, or right up close to Him. And depending on where they stand, they either mirror darkness, light, or the perfection of God in all its glory. It seems like a very odd and maybe even medieval kind of idea. But the truth is we're talking about reality in consciousness, which is different from what we're used to and how we're used to thinking about ourselves. We believe of reality as concrete and based in physicality, but there is no such thing as physicality. It's all a mental event. Beings that relate to God come closer to God and mirror God. The closer they get to God, just like well-polished mirrors, the more they reflect God. And when they're standing very close to God, all beings essentially look the same. So while we have our individuality, it's rooted in the truth that we are all God, and God is our true nature. At higher levels of being or consciousness, we experience God's love very intensely. This love is not based on anything other than God's perception that we are God. This love that God has for us is not the love for another person, but the love for Himself. In other words, to the degree that we become aware that we are God, we experience God's love. The more we understand that we are God, the more intensely we experience God's love. Because God's love is God. The two are inseparable. At the highest degree of experiencing God's love, we are identified with God. And there's no reason we can't be identified with God, because God is our true nature. Please think about it and consider it before dismissing it. Remember, when something is extended from its source, it retains the properties of its source. We are very much like God, even though it seems that we're very different from God, very separate from God. We can travel in consciousness and get closer to God, even though we remain in the physical illusion. It is possible to change our relationship to God by changing how we think and how we perceive the world. The closer we get to perceiving the world the way God perceives it, the closer we'll be to identification with God. Thank you.